By the end of the 1970s, Donna Summer was the most recognizable symbol of a sound built on spectacle, sensuality, and glittering excess. And privately, she was beginning to feel like a stranger inside that image. She had spent years living at a pace few artists ever experience. Constant touring, constant recording, constant public performance of a persona that had been carefully built around her voice and image by Casablanca Records. The demands of that schedule left little room for reflection, and by her own account, the accumulated exhaustion of it had begun to surface as something closer to a genuine identity crisis. In her own later writing, she described a period during this time when the distance between the woman performing under the lights and the woman she felt herself becoming off stage had grown almost unbearable. The queen of disco and the person she was quietly turning into could no longer, in her own words, occupy the same stage. The shift did not arrive as a single dramatic conversion, so much as a gradual unraveling of certainty. Donna Summer had spent years at the center of an industry built on image, the sequined gowns, the breathy vocal performances, the persona crafted around her by Casablanca Records, and its glittering machine. That persona had made her famous beyond anything she could have imagined during her years performing in European stage productions. But fame, by her own account, had not settled the deeper question she carried about who she actually was underneath the performance. There were, by her own later description, quiet moments backstage and between shows when the applause faded and the questions she had been avoiding simply refused to stay quiet any longer. No matter how carefully she tried to keep performing the certainty everyone around her expected to see. In her memoir, Donna Summer wrote about reaching a genuinely difficult period during these years, a moment of personal crisis, serious enough that she is described contemplating her own life while on tour. She has recounted a specific, deeply personal encounter during that time, a brief exchange with a stranger who spoke to her about faith in a way that cut through the noise of her public life and reached something she had been quietly searching for. It was, by her own description, an unremarkable exchange on the surface, a few words from someone she never expected to remember, that, nonetheless, landed with enough force to reorient the direction of her life. Whatever the precise details of that encounter, Donna Summer has been consistent in describing it as the beginning of a spiritual reawakening that would reshape the rest of her life. She has said in later interviews that she could never fully explain why those words affected her so deeply, only that they did. What followed was not an easy or immediate transformation. Becoming born again meant reckoning with an entire career built on an image she now viewed differently. The same sensuality that had made Love to Love You, Baby a cultural sensation. The same glamorous excess that Casablanca Records had spent years building around her. She was, by her own account, genuinely torn, proud of the music she had made and the barriers she had broken as a black woman at the top of the pop charts, yet increasingly uneasy about performing material that no longer reflected who she felt she had become. That unease was not performative either. Those who knew her at the time have described someone genuinely wrestling with the question in private, not simply managing how the conflict might look to the outside world. She reportedly spoke about it more openly with a small circle of friends and family than she ever did in public interviews during those years. The collision between these two identities played out in small, visible ways over the following months. Concert set lists shifted. Some of her most explicitly sensual material became noticeably less central to her live shows, replaced or reframed in ways that softened their original intent. Interviews from this period show an artist choosing her words with more caution than she once had, aware that anything she said might be read as a rejection of the very career that had made her a household name. According to those who worked alongside her during this transition, Donna Summer was navigating a genuinely difficult balancing act, unwilling to disown the music that had built her legacy, but unwilling, too, to keep performing exactly as she once had, without acknowledging how much she had changed. That balancing act extended well beyond the stage itself, shaping conversations with her management, her label, and eventually her own family about what her career should look like going forward. The industry around her had built an enormous commercial engine on the image of Donna Summer as disco's reigning symbol of glamour and sensuality. And that engine did not pause to accommodate a personal, spiritual awakening. Record labels, tour promoters, and television bookers had contracts and expectations built around the persona that had made her one of the best-selling artists of the decade. Any visible shift away from that persona carried real professional risk at a moment when disco itself, still near its commercial peak, was the foundation of her entire career. Music journalists covering her at the time noticed the shift before she ever spoke publicly about its cause, describing a performer who suddenly seemed more guarded in interviews, more selective about which songs she performed with full commitment, and less willing to lean into the overtly sensual persona the press had spent years reinforcing. Donna Summer chose not to disappear or dramatically renounce her past, but rather to find a quieter, more personal reconciliation between who she had been and who she was becoming. She continued to perform many of the songs that had made her famous, even as her private life reoriented itself around a faith that increasingly shaped how she saw her own work. According to people close to her during this period, she rarely framed the shift publicly as a rejection of disco itself, choosing instead to describe it as a deepening of her own self-understanding, an addition to who she was, rather than a repudiation of everything that had come before, a distinction she reportedly returned to often when the subject came up. Interviewers who pressed her on the subject often came away with careful, measured answers rather than dramatic pronouncements, a reflection of how deliberately she seemed to be navigating the subject in public. This reconciliation was neither instant nor total. There were moments of visible tension between her new spiritual convictions and the expectations of an audience and industry that wanted more of the Donna Summer they already knew. She recorded music during this period that leaned more explicitly into her faith, work that sat uneasily alongside the glittering disco catalog that had made her name, and that some longtime fans found difficult to reconcile with the artist they thought they knew. Critics and industry observers debated at the time and since whether her career had suffered for the shift or simply evolved alongside an artist unwilling to be frozen permanently in one image, a debate that notably she herself rarely engaged with directly. Sales figures from the period suggest no dramatic collapse in her popularity, even as some longtime observers noted a subtly different energy in her live performances during these years. What emerges from this period, looking back, is not a story of an artist abandoning her past for religion, nor an artist cynically managing her image for commercial reasons, but something more genuinely complicated. A woman who had become one of the most visible symbols of a hedonistic cultural moment, wrestling honestly and publicly with whether that symbol still represented who she actually was. she never fully resolved the tension by picking one identity over the other. Instead, by most accounts, she spent the following years learning to hold both, the Queen of Disco and the woman of deepening faith, without requiring one to erase the other. That refusal to choose one identity at the expense of the other may be, in hindsight, the most quietly radical part of her story. An artist declining the easy narrative in favor of something messier and more true to how people actually change. Disco itself, of course, was already approaching its own reckoning by the end of the 1970s. Its commercial dominance beginning to face the cultural backlash that would culminate in events like Disco Demolition Night. Donna Summer's personal transformation unfolded against this larger backdrop of a genre under siege, adding another layer to an already complicated moment in her career. An artist reconsidering her own image just as the entire movement she symbolized was being publicly rejected by parts of the culture that had once embraced it. A coincidence of timing that made her personal reckoning even harder to separate from disco's public one. In the decades since, Donna Summer's born-again conversion has remained one of the more quietly significant, if underexplored, chapters of her story, overshadowed in popular memory by the bigger, louder narratives of disco's rise and fall, the collaborations with Giorgio Moroder and Neil Bogart, the chart-topping hits that never stopped playing on oldies radio. But for Donna Summer herself, by her own repeated account, this internal collision between image and faith marked one of the most significant turning points of her life. Not because it ended her career as the Queen of Disco, but because it forced her, at the height of her fame, to decide what parts of that identity she actually wanted to keep. Biographers and music historians, revisiting her career in later decades, have increasingly pointed to this period as essential to understanding everything she did afterward, even when it goes unmentioned in shorter retrospectives of her career. She never fully stopped being disco's most glamorous symbol, and she never fully stopped being a woman of faith either. What she found, somewhere in the collision between the two, was a version of herself substantial enough to hold both at once, imperfectly, honestly, and entirely on her own terms. It is, perhaps, the least glamorous chapter of her story, and also one of the most honest, a reminder that even the most dazzling public figures are, underneath the lights, simply trying to work out who they are. Donna Summer's answer to that question, hard won and quietly held, remains one of the more human threads running through an otherwise larger-than-life career.